Hello, everybody. My name's Matt. I'm from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Thank you, everybody, for being here for the talk. So mobility is a key aspect of past human behaviour, and it's assessed in many ways archaeologically, such as through the presence of permanent architecture, storage features, burials, particular stone tool types, etc. But since mobility occurs across space, landscape scale approaches are important. And here GIS is being productively used in making inferences about mobility through site catchment analyses, least cost paths, visibility analyses, and so on and so forth. But one thing all of these kinds of approaches share in common is that they get at what we might call conceptual mobility. That is, they allow inferences about the potential to move, but are not necessarily actual indicators of movement. And this can sometimes be problematic, as the level of mobility of past people will vary depending on the wider context. For instance, the presence of permanent houses doesn't necessarily mean that people were sedentary year-round. And equally, in site catchment and other such analyses, defining what a site is might be difficult, especially in the case of highly mobile hunter-gatherer groups. So an alternative approach is one that provides independent, direct evidence of human movement. And stone artifacts are particularly useful in this regard. They're ubiquitous, they're easy to record, and they lend themselves nicely to quantitative assessments of mobility. And using modern survey equipment means it's quick and easy to precisely record the location of vast numbers of artifacts. And they can be quickly analyzed in the field, generating large databases of information such as artifact attributes, metrics, and distribution. So this information can then be used in determining quantitative assessments of artifact movement, which are by proxy direct indicators of human movement once we rule out natural transport agencies. So this paper investigates one such measure, which is the flake to core ratio. And this can indicate movement since the addition or removal of flakes or cores from an assemblage will increase or decrease that ratio, once some other factors are controlled for, which I'll explain shortly. So measures like the flake to core ratio indicate that movement occurred, but they don't necessarily tell us much about the nature of that movement across the landscape. And this is where GIS is useful, allowing the investigation of spatial relationships between stone artifact assemblages, which may otherwise be difficult to assess. So this paper is interested in how quantitative measures of stone artifacts combine with GIS analysis to shed light on the nature of past human mobility and landscape use in a way that indicates actual human movement rather than just the potential to move. So this study draws upon two separate case studies, one from the mid-Holocene Fayum in Egypt and the other from the late Holocene of Australia. So during the mid-Holocene in the Fayum, people exploited some domesticates like emmer wheat and barley, as well as wild game and aquatic resources provided by the nearby Lake Karoo. During the late Holocene in western New South Wales, in the semi-arid margins of the Australian continent, Aboriginal people had to deal with unpredictable environments and appearance of food resources, which involved frequent movement as resources became available. Ephemeral water sources, such as Peary Lake and Williford's Creek, provided important but intermittent water supplies. In both locations, people used chipped stone artifacts. In the Fayum, these were made of non-local flint, whereas in Australia, they were made predominantly from locally available silkcrete. And in both cases, artifacts are present in continuous surface scatters of variable density. So both the Fayum project, which was a collaboration between universities from the US, Netherlands, and New Zealand, and the Western New South Wales Archaeology program, or WINSWAP, which was run by the University of Auckland and Macquarie University, conducted similar extensive surface surveys of the archaeology in these regions. So in the Fayum, the north shore of Lake Karoo was systematically sampled by recording all artifacts present in these 100 by 100 meter cross-shaped transects. The boundaries of different geomorphological surfaces were also recorded to provide information about artifact visibility. The surveys in Western New South Wales were conducted within the Rutherford's Creek catchment from Peary Lake in the east and then extending west along the catchment along the creek. And the survey units here were based on the geomorphology These were scalds or areas of localized erosion, which were targeted for recording due to the high visibility of artifacts. In both regions, only artifacts greater than 20 millimeters along their maximum dimension were recorded, since artifacts smaller than that are apt to move via fluvial action. So in the Fayum, the stone artifact assemblages represent in excess of 800 years of accumulation. And in Australia, we're looking at just under 2,000 years of represented by the archaeological record. So the area of interest in the Fayum, 40 transects were surveyed, as well as a stratified mound known as COMW. The location and type of just over 50,000 stone artifacts were recorded, and of these, artifacts from COMW and 5 other transects were analysed in detail, resulting in a database of just over 13,500 stone artifacts with detailed attribute information. At Rutherford's Creek, 97 scalds were surveyed with over 27,000 artifacts analysed in detail. A sample of 10 scalds was used in the analysis here, with these scalds distributed across the length of the catchment. And the resulting data set here then is just over 9,500 artifacts with the same level of information recorded as in the Fayum case. So the question of interest is, what do these artifact distributions tell us about the nature of mobility in these temporally and spatially discrete regions? So the flake to core ratio is a common measure of how intensively stone material is being worked. Traditionally, it's used as an indicator of occupation duration or intensity, which are both really useful concepts when talking about mobility. However, there are 3 main factors or processes that affect flake to core ratios. The first is the size of the initial cobble. So holding all else constant, if 2 different size cores or cobbles are fully reduced, the larger one will produce more flakes and therefore have a higher flake to core ratio. A second factor is differential reduction intensity. More flakes generated per core increases that ratio. And the final factor, and the one of prime interest here, is artifact movement. So holding all else constant, removing flakes from an assemblage decreases the flake to core ratio, whereas removing cores increases it, and vice versa. So to understand what flake to core ratios mean in terms of artifact movement, and therefore human movement, it's necessary to first account for the differential initial cobble size and reduction intensity. So a method of correcting those flake to core ratios according to initial cobble size was employed. And what this effectively does is remove the skew in values that is caused by overly large or overly small cobbles. So just in the interest of time, I won't go over that in any detail, but there's a brief overview on the right-hand side of the slide there. But essentially what this is doing is it involves reconstructing initial cobble size based on the predominant reduction strategy used, which is inferred by analysing particular attributes of the assemblage and individual artifacts. So for both the Fayum and Rutherford's Creek, the original flake to core ratios were variable with a large range. And then applying that correction method lowered those values and reducing the spread, although there was some variation still present. So this variation could reflect differential reduction intensity or artifact movement. So the effective reduction intensity is addressed by analysing different aspects of the assemblages, such as the size and type of cores, the amount of cortex remaining on the artifacts, and flake size relative to initial cobble size, as well as how all these measures correlate with the flake to core ratios themselves. So simply put, we would expect to see indicators of high reduction intensity in those assemblages with a high flake to core ratio if, in fact, reduction intensity was a factor there. So for both the Fayum and Rutherford's Creek, these analyses suggest that differential reduction intensity isn't a major influence on those values, which kind of leaves artifact movement as perhaps one of the key explanations. So that method was then applied to all of the remaining transects in the Fayum and all of the remaining scalds in Rutherford's Creek, with much the same effect as the analysed samples only. So that reduction in variation. So high flake to core ratios may be explained by the addition of flakes or removal of cores from an assemblage and vice versa. So based on the flake to core ratio method alone, it's difficult to tell exactly what artifacts were moved, i.e. were people moving flakes or cores, without recourse to other measures. But nonetheless, the ratios do seem to indicate artifact movement and by proxy human movement. So the question then is, what was the nature of that movement? So in the Fayoum and Rutherford's Creek, did artifacts move only within the area, or was material transported away and not returned? If the lake in each region sort of focused occupation in a sense, we might expect to see a gradation in values away from the lake or towards the lake, or perhaps around some sort of central place, something to that effect. So here, GIS was used to visualize and analyze the spatial patterning in those flake-to-core ratios across the landscape. So for Rutherford's Creek, the results of a spatial autocorrelation and high-low clustering analysis suggest that the patterning in values is random, and there's no gradation in values away from the lake edge or the creek system. That there is no apparent spatial patterning and that the values are quite low overall suggests that artifacts were probably moved out of the area and not returned. Color analysis and refitting attempts have shown that some artifacts did move between skalds. However, the results of the spatial analysis in combination with general assemblage characteristics suggest that movement outside of the area is a significant factor here. It's unlikely that such a small number of flakes were produced per core on average, and this is corroborated by ethnographic accounts of Aboriginal flaking behavior. So that suggests that the products of stone reduction are missing from the assemblages. And equally, given the local abundance of raw material, it seems unlikely that material was brought into the area from elsewhere. The wider environmental context also supports the notion of movement away from the area. Due to localized rainfall, water sources were intermittent, and food resources fluctuated in an unpredictable manner. Therefore, probably unlikely to sustain prolonged occupation, prompting movement out of the area to other foraging zones. For the Fayoum, those similar analyses suggest a similar lack of patterning in those flake-to-core ratio values. COMW does, however, stand out with a particularly high flake-to-core ratio. So perhaps flakes were moved to this area or cores were removed from it. Or perhaps artifacts also left the area, like at Rutherford's Creek. Undoubtedly, movement out of the area occurred. However, a predominant settlement strategy that involved movement of artifacts out of the area and not being returned would not really explain why some parts, some transects in the area have high values and others have particularly low values. Moving out of the area entirely would also involve traveling significant distances into the surrounding arid environment. And given the wider environmental context again, in particular the somewhat predictable resource base of Lake Karoo, the patterning in those flake-to-core ratios makes sense in terms of movement within the region, the opposite of Rutherford's Creek, though this is not readily apparent from the distribution in values themselves. Nonetheless, for at least some time during the period represented by the archaeological record of the area, it was probably not necessary for people to move entirely away from the region like they did at Rutherford's Creek in Australia. But people did move to some degree, as indicated by these flake-to-core ratios, suggesting a settlement pattern in the Fayoum that involved a complex interaction with that lake edge environment and exploitation of domesticated resources. So just to wrap up, this research has been concerned with understanding long-term patterns of movement across landscapes, patterns that are not necessarily reflected in spatially discrete sites or assemblages of artifacts resulting from single events. Quantitative measures of stone artifact movement, like the flake-to-core ratio, provide independent evidence of human movement, but it's a GIS-based analysis of the spatial distribution of those assemblages and values that sheds light on the nature of movement. Even so, both approaches should be combined with a careful consideration of the wider context in which they're situated to obtain that clearer picture of past human landscape use. So moving forward, there are two main things that this research will really benefit from. The first is the production of an experimental stone assemblage to evaluate that method of reconstructing initial cobble size, which is kind of key to the whole research here. And the second is computer simulation of stone artifact assemblage formation to investigate how patterning in the flake-to-core ratios is produced. So the use of computer simulation would allow one to control a range of variables in order to determine how different factors affect that patterning in the flakes and core ratios across space, and provide a comparative base for the actual archaeology itself. So I would just like to acknowledge the following people and organizations who helped with this research, and of course everybody here for listening. So kia ora, thank you.